Some of the top free agent starting pitchers are already off the board this offseason, and the Orioles have not yet added to their staff. So where do they turn next? We'll try to figure that out and answer your Orioles questions coming up on this live mailbag episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Sunday, December 15th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are taking your Orioles questions. So if you have questions about the O's, about the offseason, about anything related to Birdland, put them in the chat here. If you are watching live on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel, we thank you so much for tuning in. And if you are, again, put those comments in the chat, put those mailbag questions in the chat, and we will get to them throughout this episode. We'll answer your Orioles question. We'll talk a little bit more about the most recent Orioles news as well in terms of pursuing some starting pitching. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. So thanks to everyone who's joining us now. Again, live mailbag episode. If you're watching this here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel on Sunday evening, hope you're having a good Sunday, enjoying a pretty straightforward Ravens win. Another fantastic performance from Lamar Jackson as we briefly turn our attention back to the baseball side. And before I kind of open it up for the questions, I wanted to briefly touch on the latest Orioles starting pitching news, because since I last chatted with you all, that was Thursday evening's episode. If you haven't checked that one out, make sure to go and do so here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel or wherever you listen to your podcasts as well, as I kind of broke down the best trade scenarios out there for the Orioles in terms of trying to acquire a top of the rotation starting pitcher. And I went through some of the names, and I took some of your mock trades as well and graded those out. But since then, we've gotten a little bit more news, and that came from Ken Rosenthal of The Athletic, who put out another notes column on Saturday. And this was, again, real journalism that Ken Rosenthal did, unlike some other things that have gone around about the Orioles recently. But Ken wrote extensively about the O's pursuit of starting pitching, and he talked about how the Orioles are engaged in, potentially looking for a starter via trade, and said they were one of the, handful of teams who have checked in on Luis Castillo, the starter for the Mariners, who had 3 years remaining on his deal and potentially could vest for a 4th year remaining as well. He does have a no trade clause, so he's a guy who would have to say yes to any kind of trade, but he could be the perfect guy for the Orioles. He's not the pitcher he was in Cincinnati or early on with Seattle. He's changed himself a little bit. I kind of broke down his game on Thursday's episode, but it's good to know that, hey, they are looking for right-handed power, specifically first and third baseman. The Orioles have those guys, Kobe Mayo and Ryan Mountcastle being the big ones that are on that list. And the Orioles are at least checking in with the Mariners. Now, we figured that would happen, especially since the reports came out last week that the Mariners may be shopping Castillo a little bit. But I think the bigger news from Ken's column on Saturday is that the Orioles are maybe more open than we expected to a reunion with Jack Flaherty. Now, Flaherty, at this point, is really one of the best starting pitchers left on the market. Obviously, on the free agent market, Corbin Burnes is the best starter left. He was the best starter left to begin the offseason. He's still out there, and he still has not been signed. But Ken writing that if the Orioles fail in their pursuit in bringing back Corbin Burnes, and everything he said basically said, hey, the Orioles are still interested in this, but it doesn't seem like, they are front runners right now. I know that, Boston's been pursuing him, but the Giants were kind of aggressively going after Burnes as well. Rosenthal writing that the Orioles would be absolutely willing to a Flaherty reunion if they can't bring back Corbin Burnes. And we know how poorly it went. The Orioles traded for Flaherty from the Cardinals at the 2023 deadline. They needed to bolster the rotation. Instead, he was horrible down the stretch, got moved to the bullpen, and was basically a mop-up guy when we got to the postseason. It did not do well. He went to free agency. He signed a 1-year deal with the Tigers just to basically regain any value. And he was great. He made 28 starts this year. He had a 3.17 ERA with a 3.48 FIP. He had a 30% strikeout rate to a 6% walk rate. The Tigers dealt him to the Dodgers at the deadline. Now, he wasn't amazing, but he had some good starts in the postseason and helped the Dodgers win the World Series. And now he is a free agent again. And he could be, you can make an argument that, again, he is the second best starter remaining out there. You can make a bigger argument that he's at least the second best right-handed starter out there behind Corbin Burnes. And when you sort by all of the remaining free agent pitchers left, and you sort by guys who made at least 15 starts last year, so basically guys who were healthy for at least half of the season and can give us some sort of sample size. If you sort that by all of the starting pitchers out there and sort by FIP, which is sometimes a better explainer than ERA, can be a better predictor of what's going to come soon, Jack Flaherty with a 3.48 FIP, best among all available free agents. Corbin Burnes is number 2, but even if you just sort by ERA, what actually happened? Corbin Burnes number 1 at 2.92, Jack Flaherty number 2 at 3.17. If you sort by strikeout minus walk rate, those are big things, right? How big a difference is there between your strikeouts and your walks? Like, yeah, it's great when guys strike out a lot of batters, but if they walk a lot as well, it's not helping you as much. 24% strikeout minus walk rate. None of these free agents better than Jack Flaherty in that category. It's pretty impressive to look at. Like, he was number 2 in Fangraphs WAR behind Corbin Burnes with what he did. Now, he threw 30 fewer innings than Burnes. So that's obviously something to take into account. But it's interesting to look at how good Flaherty was. Now, Rosenthal's reporting talking about how the Orioles know that Flaherty was kind of gassed at the end of a long season. When he came to the O's in 2023, it was his first full healthy season in the big league since 2019. So it had been a while since he had pitched an entire season. And I think the Orioles felt he was gassed. Now, there were also some issues between Jack Flaherty and Chris Holt in that clubhouse a bit. And there was a bit of a blow up there. But Chris Holt, lost the pitching coach job. Now he's no longer with the organization. He is now the Red Sox bullpen coach for 2025. And it seems like at the very least, the Orioles are open to a reunion. Now, I've talked about it this offseason. Like, when I did my right-handed starting pitcher wish list for free agency, I mentioned how Jack Flaherty is probably one of the, I do a top 6. I mentioned that Jack Flaherty is one of the 6 best starting pitchers out there, righty-wise. But I just didn't put him on my list because I figured with how it went just a year and change ago, I just figured the Orioles wouldn't go that direction. But now, as other players go off the board, and we're learning that the Orioles are scared away by the qualifying offer, so that takes guys like Sean Manaea and Nick Pivetta off the board, even though the two of them are still free agents. You kind of zero in on Jack Flaherty, especially if, the Corbin Burnes bidding is going to go to 250 to 300 million, and the Orioles are going to be priced out, at least from their own perspective. You kind of see where the O's could land on Jack Flaherty, because if he can even somewhat repeat what he did with Detroit and the Dodgers, he's only 29 years old. He's got great stuff. I mean, I'm going to show you right here if you're watching on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. First, we're going to show the Baseball Savant page for Jack Flaherty in 2023. That was his split season between the Cardinals and the Orioles. And you can see, like, he wasn't getting hit super hard, but otherwise, like, nothing special looking at that page, right? You're looking at maybe an okay and probably a below average big league starter. Flip it now. I'm showing the 2024 Savant page between the Tigers and the Dodgers. Basically, it looks like he finally got healthy again. His stuff was playing. Great swing and miss numbers, great strikeout numbers, really low hard hit rates. Expected ERA was great. Like, getting guys to chase way out of the zone. Those are all good numbers you're looking at for Flaherty. And I'm not sure I'm convinced he's going to repeat that. Again, we've seen too much bad stuff. Again, it was a half a season, but we've seen bad stuff in an Oriole uniform. So that certainly worries me. So I'm not going to get fully behind, hey, bring in Jack Flaherty. But it is interesting that the Orioles are at least more than kicking the Tigers, are kicking the Tigers. Yeah, well, they might kick the Tigers. I know the Tigers want Flaherty back as well. But kicking the Tigers on Jack Flaherty and are at least interested in bringing him back. But wanted to at least take a look at, the pitching that's out there. If we're kind of looking at the best arms, I would rank them probably Corbin Burnes number 1. Then I would go probably Nick Pivetta number 2, Sean Manaea number 3, Walker Buehler number 4, Jack Flaherty number 5 in terms of the top 5 remaining free agents that I would want the Orioles to go after. So Flaherty sneaks in there because, again, a lot of other names are off the board, but I'm still a little timid about the Orioles making that move. Now, if they can get Flaherty and someone else, well, maybe I'm a little on board. But if Flaherty becomes your biggest issue or your biggest addition, I'm not feeling great about that. And a question here from Breton, not counting Sasaki. I'm not going to count Roki Sasaki here because he's just in a different stratosphere. He comes from a different amount of money. Like you would be signing him through your international bonus pool money. So really signing Sasaki, except for using that roster spot and rotation spot, really doesn't have a lot to do with what else you're doing in free agency and in trades. So I would love the Orioles to go get Sasaki, and they should be in the running, but I kind of put him in a different category for now. But I do want to get to your Orioles questions, and we've got some good ones already in the chat. So we're going to take a quick break here, and when we come back, your Orioles questions are answered. So you got time, while I'm doing a couple of ad reads, to put those questions in the chat here on YouTube, and we will talk Orioles when we come back from this quick little break. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Now, we know it's NFL season. The Ravens are on the brink of clinching a playoff spot, and you can get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. And today's episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by SelectQuote. The World Series, the Super Bowl, the Olympics, the world's top athletes get to play in these top-level sporting events thanks to one thing, teamwork. And teamwork can also protect your financial legacy and your family's future. SelectQuote's licensed insurance agents are the perfect teammates when shopping for customized, affordable life insurance. They can find you the right policy to keep your financial legacy safely in your family's end zone. And in sports, winning is everything. That's why you always need a good strategy to keep you moving towards the goalposts. And that's why on this team, you get life insurance through SelectQuote to protect your legacy and your family's financial future. You invest so much time in taking care of yourself to be the healthiest, best version of you. SelectQuote's exclusive policies can reward that effort. Get the right life insurance for you for less at SelectQuote.com/lockedon. Again, go to SelectQuote.com/lockedon to get started today. One more time, that is SelectQuote.com/lockedon. So it's time to jump into your questions here on a live mailbag episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. And let's start with Zyleek here on YouTube, who asks, do you really think there is hope for a Dylan Cease trade? The Padres have kind of been floating some rumors that they might be open to dealing Dylan Cease. He's in the final year of his deal. The Padres are looking to shed some payroll. He'd be making about $14 million next season before he hits free agency, but he's coming off a great year with the San Diego Padres. Threw a no-hitter, had a 2.6 ERA down the stretch. He's got some of the best stuff of any starting pitcher in baseball. We know the Orioles were interested in trading for him last offseason. Couldn't get a deal done. The White Sox dealt him to the Padres. Now the Padres may be dealing him. And honestly, I do think there's hope. Like the Orioles were able to do a similar trade last offseason when they got Corbin Burnes. Yeah, they gave up good players and Joey Ortiz and DL Hall and gave up a draft pick as well. But that trade worked out. I know the Orioles got bounced in the first round, didn't win a World Series. And it seems more than likely that Burnes is going to walk and sign elsewhere in free agency, although the Orioles at least remain connected and interested in bringing him back. If they can't bring Burnes back and this is the way they want to do things, I think there's real hope because the Orioles still have, now they don't have the #1 farm system in baseball anymore, but they still have a good enough system to trade away prospects and guys who are big league ready to make that deal with the Padres. And they have the ability now with David Rubenstein to take on money that other teams don't want. If the Padres are looking to shed payroll, the Orioles should be looking to bring in payroll. I'm not going to say it's going to happen, but I think the Orioles should be a top 5 suitor and potential landing spot for Dylan Cease if he is traded. Let's see. This is Drehy Reigns asking, what would be your best case scenario for the rest of the offseason? Truly best case scenario is the Orioles re-sign Corbin Burnes, and then they bring in a Sean Manaea, Nick Pivetta, Jack Flaherty type who can be like a number 3 starter. And you look at your rest of your team and you say, okay, we've got Corbin Burnes at the top. Then we've got Grayson Rodriguez, Zach Eflin, Nick Pivetta, and Dean Kremer. And I feel real good about that rotation going into the year. There's not much more I would do offensively at this point with the team. But yeah, best case scenario is bring back Burnes and you still add one more starter on top of that. Let's see. We've got a question here from QR Stav V asking O'Hearn, Arias, and McDermott for Luis Castillo. Unfortunately, I do not think the Mariners would make that deal. I think they would want Chase McDermott. And I also do think they would want Ramon Arias. They had his brother Luis Arias last year and it didn't work out. I think Ramon Arias could be the starting third baseman for the Mariners. He is better than any of the options they have right now. But I just think for a batter, they're going to want someone with a little higher ceiling. And although O'Hearn would be the best hitter involved in that deal, I think they'd rather get right-handed than left-handed, it seems like. And remember, O'Hearn is also a free agent after next year. So if they're going to give up Luis Castillo, who has 3 and maybe 4 years left on his deal, they're going to want the main hitter in that package to be signed under team control for more than just 2025. If you maybe threw in Mountcastle instead of O'Hearn, so then you get a righty with more team control with Arias and McDermott, that is maybe a trade that the Mariners would be willing to talk about. Dave White with a question. I'm assuming this is a Pirates fan here. What would it take to get Jordan Westburg to the Pirates? Well, Dave, it probably starts with sending the Orioles either Mitch Keller or Jared Jones. There was some reporting last week that floated that the Pirates are at least taking calls on the idea of trading their top 2 pitchers behind, well, they're 2 and 3 pitchers behind Paul Skeens in Mitch Keller and Jared Jones. Mitch Keller, kind of more of an established guy who's been okay and kind of already got the contract extension. Jared Jones hasn't reined it all in yet, but has like the stuff to potentially be the next Spencer Strider. I'm not saying it would be a 1-for-1 deal. It would maybe be interesting, but if the Orioles were really going to deal Jordan Westburg, it would have to involve one of those guys. It would probably have to involve Jared Jones in that trade. And yeah, Joe right here with Mountie and Ramon for Luis Castillo, a little bit closer to some guys that they would be looking to go after. Let's see. Next question I want to get to. Let's see here. All right. So this is a question from Jonathan here. Do you think Cedric Mullins could be traded if the Orioles are okay with Cowser as a center fielder? I do. I really do. And I think at the end of the day, I don't believe the Orioles are going to bring back Cedric Mullins after this year. Mullins is going into his final year before he hits free agency. And I don't know. The long-term plan is either Cowser moves to center, which is a total possibility. Like, it's not out of the question. Or it's that Enrique Bradfield or Vance Honeycutt are kind of ready to go in the next year or two where they can come up and be that center fielder. But I think if the Orioles were able to find a suitor for Cedric Mullins that could get them major league pitching back for this year in a deal, I think they would be okay playing Cowser in center field this season if they potentially made that deal. And here is another thing I'm just going to float here. If the Orioles dealt Cedric Mullins for pitching and moved Colton Cowser to center field, I wouldn't rule out the possibility, if Anthony Santander doesn't get the deal he wants from other teams, of him having a chance to come back to Baltimore then, because there would be an opening in the outfield. Speaking of openings in the outfield, here's a question from Joe. What do you think about O'Neill's splits playing left field versus right field? 303 batting average in right field, 168 batting average in left field. If that's the case, really doesn't mean much to me. I don't think the position you're playing has too much of an effect. It might have a little one, but that's probably just noise if you're having splits that big playing positions. I think if the Orioles stay like they are, you're mostly going to see Mullins in center, Cowser in left, and O'Neill in right, because that's going to be their best defensive alignment. O'Neill won't play center, but with the wall moved back in a bit in left field, it becomes easier to play left field. I don't think you any longer need like a second center fielder out there defensively. We know how good Cowser was. He was a Gold Glove finalist. Quite frankly, he should have won the Gold Glove in left field this year, but you could see some O'Neill in left, especially against left-handers this year. Now, it's all going to depend on how Cedric Mullins performs against lefties. He's been so up and down against them, but the last couple of years, he's been terrible against left-handed pitching. So when the O's face lefties, I think we're probably going to see Cowser play center, and then you might see O'Neill in left, and honestly, Kjerstad get the starts against left-handers and play right field for the Orioles. They'll probably switch some things around as well to make that happen. But I definitely can see some O'Neill in left field against lefties, but he'll mostly be patrolling right field for the Orioles. QR Stab V with another question. What will it take to get Dylan Cease to Baltimore? I'm going to direct you to Thursday's episode because I talked a lot about that and what it could look like to get that deal done. But I certainly think a trade like that is a possibility. Let's see. Question here from Mark. Do you think Mountcastle's defense at first base is enough to try to keep him? O'Hearn just didn't dig out as many balls out of the dirt. Gunnar and Westburg certainly appreciate it. I think, first of all, Ryan Mountcastle is clearly a better defender at first base than Ryan O'Hearn. He passes the eye test, he passes the metric test, and he was rewarded with being a Gold Glove finalist at first base in the American League this year. Now, the issue is, as someone who, not talking play professional baseball, but played first base a lot of my life on the baseball diamond, I can tell you right now, it's one of the easier positions to play. I don't know if I yet to call it the easiest, but it's on the easier side of the spectrum, despite what Ron Washington's character in Moneyball wants to say that it's incredibly hard. It's hard, but it's on the easier side. That's why a lot of guys like Mountcastle, who was drafted as a shortstop, tried him at third, tried him in the outfield, ended up settling in as his big league position at first base because it's a little easier to learn. So first base defense usually doesn't become something that is the deal breaker. I think if the Orioles find a trade where they can move Mountcastle and get pitching back, they will do it. And if they don't, they will hold Mountcastle and play him a lot this year. It basically depends on what his value ends up being on the trade market. I don't think his first base defense, while it helps, has a whole lot to do with what his value becomes. Here's a good question from Walter. Do you think the Orioles have any interest in taking on bad money in a trade? Was curious if they might ask the White Sox about a combo for Benintendi and Garrett Crochet to lower the prospect load before Crochet got dealt. What Walter is talking about, Andrew Benintendi has been okay at times and bad at times. He signed, I believe it was a 5-year deal with the Chicago White Sox. Yeah, 5 years, $75 million deal. So only $15 million per year, but he signed through 2027. So he still has 3 more years left on that deal. And with the White Sox shedding payroll, you would think maybe they want to get out from under that. And that could have been a way to go get Garrett Crochet. You could say, hey, we're going to take Andrew Benintendi and all of his money. He might be able to help our outfield as kind of a fourth outfielder. And we are able to pay him with David Rubenstein. And because we're taking that money off your books, we don't have to give you as good of prospects in the return to also get Garrett Crochet. Teams do that. It's been done before. Teams with a lot of payroll room do it. In theory, the Orioles with the new ownership and a generally low payroll should have a lot of payroll room to be willing to do that. Now, the weird part about it is, 3 years with Benintendi, do you really want to keep him around? But for only $15 million a year, if you have to DFA him, you have to DFA him. That's not a lot of money each year, again, if you're operating on that next plane. So we'll see if the Orioles will be interested, maybe with the Padres, because the Padres are really strung out on cutting some payroll. Maybe there's someone else. Now, I'm not saying they're going to take the 10-year Xander Bogaerts contract, but maybe there's another contract on that Padres team, maybe Jake Cronenworth potentially, that the Orioles could take on to maybe lower the prospect haul it would take to get a Dylan Cease. That is certainly, I think, a possibility for the Orioles. Question from Mason. If we miss on all the free agents, you see a trade for Framber Valdez. Also talked about this on Thursday's episode, so make sure and go back and check that one out. But I do think the Orioles should be in on Framber. I think the O's have pieces that perfectly fit the Astros. I talked about how I think Ryan Mountcastle and Heston Kjerstad for Framber Valdez could be a perfect trade. Now, you might feel like that's a lot to get Valdez for just 1 year, but the Astros need a right-handed hitting first baseman, Mountcastle, and now that they traded Kyle Tucker to the Cubs, they need a long-term right fielder. That's Heston Kjerstad. So maybe in that deal, what you could do is you could eat all the Ryan Presley money because we know they want to get rid of him, and maybe that helps you give up a little bit less, but I think they should be in on Framber. However, Dana Brown, the Houston GM, I believe, talked yesterday after the Tucker trade and was basically like, we're still taking calls on Framber Valdez, but I don't see us trading him. We'll see how much that is true, or it's just like him trying to drive the price up. But it's it'll be interesting to see if he is available. Let's see. We got good questions here. We'll take one more question before the break and then get to plenty more after. Another one from Walter. Which Orioles player do you think has the most next level potential to reach up to? I think Cowser could have a top 10 MVP season in him. This is still from Walter, if he can figure out the breaking ball problems. Cowser's certainly one of them. In terms of next level potential, I think it's Grayson Rodriguez, honestly. Like, we've seen Grayson be really good, but he's also had some struggles and he's dealt with injuries. If Grayson Rodriguez can stay fully healthy in 2025, there's a chance that he is the ace that the Orioles are looking for. Like, he has that kind of potential. And again, we've seen it in starts. We've seen it for certain stretches, but we haven't seen it play out over, 3-4 months because of injuries, because of ineffectiveness, being younger. I think that's not being talked about enough. Now, that doesn't mean I think the Orioles shouldn't add pitching because Grayson Rodriguez is going to be a number one, but I think that could happen for him in 2025, and that would be a nice big jump forward. Plenty more questions. Continue to put your questions in the chat here. We'll get them answered after the break, but do have to get to one more break to talk about our partners here on the Locked On Orioles podcast. And this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Gametime. You know Gametime. It's the best place to go and get your tickets, but Gametime is focused on togetherness this holiday season. That means when you bring people together at live events, the experience is that much better. And it's the perfect gift. Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for live events even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Now, you might not be buying baseball tickets anytime soon, at least until the season starts, but how about basketball? How about hockey? How about football? Tickets are there at Gametime. If it's also, hey, you know what? Baseball's my sport. The offseason is the offseason. Well, Gametime Picks, the curation makes it easier to save, not just on sports, but also concerts, comedy, theater, and more. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB. That is LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. And today's episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by the DK Law Group. When you need a law firm, do you want the legal runaround, or would you rather have a no-nonsense approach? Well, you get the latter with the DK Law Group. The DK Law Group specializes in real estate law, estate planning, business law, and family law. They're tech savvy, they treat their clients like family, and they focus on keeping your legal solutions simple. And the DK Law Group knows that speed is key. By leveraging technology, DK Law Group streamlines the process to serve you better and faster. So contact DK Law Group today at dklawmd.com. And Locked On Orioles listeners can call today to schedule a free 30-minute consultation when you mention the tagline, Empowering Legacies. So we are back here on a live mailbag episode of Locked On Orioles podcast. Thank you so much for getting those questions in. Continue to put your questions here in the chat if you're watching live on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Make sure to subscribe as well. We are just shy of 8,000 subscribers right now on the channel. When we get to 8,000, we're going to do a cool Orioles giveaway for subscribers only. So make sure you are subscribed on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Another question from Joe here. Do you think the Orioles signed the polar bear, a.k.a. Pete Alonso? I don't know. Again, if they maybe traded Mountcastle for pitching, there could be an opening there. I just think if they do trade Mountcastle, that first base option will go some to O'Hearn, and Kobe Mayo will play more over there. And I don't see them shelling out the money there. I do think the Mets are going to probably overpay to bring Pete Alonso back. I think it was maybe in their thoughts at one point, but I'm just not sure it is going to happen. Let's see. Question from Conch here. Do you think there's a chance they extend Dylan Cease if they trade for him? Now, this is something obviously the Orioles did not do with Corbin Burnes. They brought him in. Technically they still could at least get a long-term deal with him, but they weren't able to kind of work out any kind of extension with him. Now, here is the other thing about Dylan Cease is that, at least from the last time I checked, Dylan Cease is a Scott Boras client, and Scott Boras generally does not like his clients to take those extensions before they hit free agency. And with a guy like Dylan Cease, who'd be hitting free agency at age 30, age 29, with the stuff that he has, he is going to make a pretty penny in free agency next offseason. I think the Orioles would try, but I don't think they'd be able to get something done with Cease. And I think it would just kind of be a one-year trade like it was for Corbin Burnes. Jesus with a question here. Does Walker Buehler make sense for the Orioles? I think he does. He's kind of an interesting case where, before the Tommy John surgery, he was fantastic. Then he had all the issues with the surgery, finally came back in the second half this year for the Dodgers, but just was not the same pitcher. Now, we saw him pitch well at times and close out the World Series for the Dodgers in the postseason. I just don't know what he is. All the reporting surrounding Buehler is that he wants a deal with multiple opt-outs. So basically, he can sign a prove-it deal where it's maybe a 3-year deal, but there's an opt-out after year 1 and year 2. So he can try and rebuild his value, show that he is the pitcher he used to be before the injury, and then opt out of his deal, become a free agent again, and try and get that big long-term deal. I honestly think a deal like that makes sense for the Orioles. It's what they did with Tyler O'Neill. They signed him to a 3-year deal, but it has an opt-out after year 1, so that if O'Neill finally stays healthy and produces, he can opt out and get a much bigger deal in free agency next winter. So if the O's were willing to do that with O'Neill, I would think they'd be willing to do that with Walker Buehler. He doesn't have the qualifying offer on him, so you don't have to give up a draft pick to sign him either. I think he does make a lot of sense for the O's, but there really hasn't been a lot of smoke around Buehler and the O's. To be fair, though, most of the smoke with Walker Buehler has been the A's wanted to sign him, and he said, I don't want to play in Sacramento. So I think the Walker Buehler market is moving a little bit slower than we thought. Conch has another question. I figured I'd get asked this. Do you think there's any truth to the pitcher list article about Elias not wanting to spend? To me, it read like an angry employee's letter. I'll give my little line on this. Like, I like the people at Pitcher List. Nick Pollock does great stuff. I like Ben Palmer. He's been on this show. I've been on his show. I really like Alex Fass, all the stuff they do over there. It feels like they overstepped on this one. Now, I'm not saying everything in that article is false about, basically claiming that Mike Elias is being told by David Rubenstein, here's all this money, spend it. And he's basically on a power trip saying, no, I'm not going to spend any of your money. There could be some truth in some of these things that Elias, really wants to build the thing his way. We kind of know that. He doesn't love giving out giant contracts to free agents. We know that as well. So there may be a little truth in what this is saying, but it had one anonymous source. It was not stated why that source was anonymous. And those quotes that were given, it read like a disgruntled employee, potentially a disgruntled former employee who just got fired. That's what it sounds like. And that's not journalism. You didn't get multiple sources. You didn't get both sides. You didn't try to corroborate the story. That's not journalism. Pitcher List does a fantastic job of the things they do, breaking down pitching and hitting and fantasy baseball. It's a great website. I've used it before for data on players and pitchers and all that good stuff. But they waded into reporting waters. And I'm not saying you can't as a site like that, but you got to have some journalistic standards. And I mean, the quotes in that read like an angry caller on 105.7 The Fan calling Brandon Hyde a puppet. That's what it actually said in there. If those things were true, they would have fired Brandon Hyde. If the things said in that were true, they had the opening to do it. And obviously they didn't. He's coming back as Orioles manager next year. So just a really, really weird piece of quote unquote reporting. And again, it's not something I put too much credence into. Here's a question from Frodo here. George Kirby and Cole Young for Westburg and Holiday. Wow. We are firing up the trade machine right here. That one breaks my brain a little bit, to be quite honest with you. I think both teams would consider that deal, but I don't even have the brain capacity in the middle of this mailbag to tell you whether or not that'd be a good deal for the Orioles. One thing I'll tell you is I think Jackson Holiday should be untouchable for the Orioles and is going to be a star, and Westburg was just an all-star, so that's a lot to give up. I'd probably say no, but hey, you know what? I like jumping out there with a name like that. Question from John. Do you think the Orioles should look into signing Tanner Scott? John, I'm going to say no, not because I don't like Tanner Scott, although he frustrated me to no end when he was an Oriole, and he's much better now than he was then, which is why he seems to still be the number one relief pitcher remaining on the market. But the predictions are him getting about 4 years, $60+ million as a reliever. And contracts like that for relievers generally tend to not work out. And especially when the Orioles have the history they do with Tanner Scott, drafted, developed, and traded him to the Marlins. I just don't see the Orioles going in that direction. Now, if his market crashes and he becomes a guy who has to take like a big 1-year deal, then maybe I'm in. But if he's still looking at 4-year offers, I'm not super interested in Tanner Scott. Let's see. Walter with a question here. Aside from an ace, do you think the Orioles are looking at any other rotation signings? If so, who do you think gets pushed out of the rotation? Yeah, I mean, I think the Orioles should be going after a kind of a number one type and a number 3 or 4 type in the rotation. I still think they should sign 2 starting pitchers, or at least acquire, whether it's sign or trade, 2 starting pitchers before the offseason is over. If they do that, say they get Dylan Cease and they sign Walker Buehler, and that's their 2 moves. I think you have those 2 plus Grayson Rodriguez plus Zach Eflin and plus Dean Kremer. I think if the season started tomorrow, your predicted rotation would be Rodriguez, Eflin, Kremer, Suarez, and Povich. I think Albert Suarez and Cade Povich right now would be the 2 guys who would get pushed out of that group. But we shall see. If they only sign 1 or trade for 1 starter before the offseason is over, it really be down to Povich versus Suarez, and then Chase McDermott and Trevor Rogers are both kind of in the mix right there to potentially get that final spot. I think they would at least give it to Povich, I'd say, actually. You know what, Povich, because Suarez can pitch out of the bullpen and would still potentially make the team. There's really more of a statement here from Arlo. They should sign Jorge Lopez. He had a 2 ERA last year with Chicago. I'm always down for bringing Jorge Lopez back. They've already done it once after trading him. So down to bring him back and at least let him compete for a bullpen spot for the Orioles. We get to a few more questions here. Continue to put them in the chat. This is a question from Mark. Are the O's out on Burnes? If not, what do you think it would take? Would Burnes take a large, shorter deal if this drags on too much longer? We're still in December, so I wouldn't say it's super dragging on yet. Yeah, we're past the winter meetings, but there's still plenty of time to sign a deal. Now, if we get to February and Burnes is still a free agent, then maybe he does think about taking a 4-ish year deal with, like a 4-year, $200 million deal where he gets $50 million a year and really gets finally that big money. I could see that happening. And I could see the Orioles maybe being interested in something like that, because it seems like the thing that scares away Mike Elias more than anything is committing 6, 7, 8, 9 years to a starting pitcher. Like that seems to scare him more than anything. But Mark, the reporting is that the Orioles are at least still in on Burnes, not fully out on him. But what it seems like is if the price goes above 250 to 300 million, if the years go above, 6, 7 plus, the Orioles just aren't going to play in that pool for starting pitching, whether you like it or not. And for a pitcher like Burnes, I kind of don't like being scared off by that, but that just seems to be the reality of the situation. What do I think it would take to get Burnes right now? I mean, offering him 8 years and $275 million, offering him 10 years, 300, something like that would get him here immediately. Otherwise, he's still waiting for that number 1 offer to come out there. Question from Daniel here. Will Samuel Basallo break next year? I'm going to assume Daniel doesn't mean break like get injured. I'm hoping not. Assuming he means break in or break out. Break in, I say yes. Break out, I'll say no. So break in, I do think we'll see Basallo next September. That's my prediction on him debuting. And I think he'll come up strictly as a DH. I think he'll come up and he'll be the 3rd catcher on the roster. He'll probably catch a few innings here and there if the Orioles need him to, but he'll strictly be there as a DH to help this lineup when his bat is fully ready. Breakout, I just don't think he'll have the time to. I think we'll have to wait till 2026 for that to happen in an Orioles uniform. Adit with a good question here. Is there a pitcher, trade, or free agent that isn't connected to the Orioles much in the media that is likely to be a target under the radar, like a guy like Justin Verlander? Justin Verlander, probably not the most under the radar because he is, a future Hall of Fame pitcher, but I still think the O's could be at least kicking the tires on a guy like Verlander. I think he's going to go back to Detroit for kind of one last hurrah with a Tigers team that's turning into a playoff team again. I think that would be really cool. And I think that's where he is going to end up for probably his final big league season in 2025. I don't know, for the Orioles, you never know what's going to happen on the trade front, in the free agency front. Andrew Heaney is a less exciting kind of guy that I just think fits with the Orioles so well that they could go after. Someone like, Roki Sasaki's not under the radar, but man, that would be a perfect addition for the Orioles. I'd probably have to comb through a lot more of the guys who are out there that the O's could potentially be connected to. It could be someone more so tradable than maybe a free agent guy, but Verlander's a possibility. Max Scherzer is certainly a possibility for this team. Walter with another question. You think there's anything to make out of Rogers' finish in AAA? He strung together a few really nice starts to end the year. Talked about that on an episode last week. I believe it was the last mailbag. Talked about what Rogers did differently. But he did change some things with the shape of his pitches, with the command. I think it will make a difference for him, and he can help the Orioles in 2025. Let's see. We will go 2 more questions here. We got 2 more to finish things out. From Conch, who is the most likely pitcher in free agency on another team to be an Oriole by spring training? I would say right now the most likely guy to be an Oriole is, they're going to sign a pitcher, right? I'm going to say Andrew Haney. He feels like a cheap option you could put at the back of the rotation. He's a lefty. He's been pretty good the last couple of years. Like, he just feels like whether he's the only signing and we get mad or he's the number 2 signing because they make a trade, like he just feels so... I've been trying to combine him with the Orioles for the last 3 years. This just feels like the guy who is going to be with the O's. And then Arlo with the final question of the day. Do you think Dean Kremer could get under a 3.5 ERA in the 2025 season? I think he absolutely could. I'm not sure he will, but I don't think he has to, because in a perfect world, the Orioles add 2 starters, and Dean Kremer is your number 5. And if Dean Kramer's posting a 4 ERA, but he's giving you 170 innings out of the number 5 spot, that is all you can potentially ask for from Dean Kremer. And I do think he has a ceiling that's higher than that, but even if it's, again, a 4 ERA, 160-ish innings, that would be great if Kramer's your number 5 starter. Now, if you don't do anything and Kramer's your number 3, you might need him to get under a 3.5 ERA. But at this point, if you do things you need to do and take care of your business and add guys this offseason, you don't need to ask as much from him. That'll do it for today's episode. Thank you all so much for getting in those mailbag questions. We will continue with the mailbag episodes throughout the offseason, so look for them. Some will be live, some will not. I'm thinking about potentially maybe going live every Monday evening. I know this was a Sunday evening episode, but maybe every Monday evening throughout the offseason, we're looking at going live right around 8:30 p.m., right around this one. So keep your eye on the Locked On Orioles YouTube page for some live podcasts on Monday evenings. Now, this is the first week, and if you've been following along with the show for a while, you know that things get a little further apart in the offseason. This is the first week where, as a network, we are switching to 3 episodes per week. So we usually do 5 episodes Monday through Friday, at least from now until when pitchers and catchers report to spring training in late February. We are back down to 3 episodes a week. So I can't guarantee that it's always going to be Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and that is because, there's always signings that could happen, but we will generally follow a schedule of Monday-ish, Wednesday-ish, and Friday-ish. It'll be a little different throughout the holidays. Once we get past the new year, we'll probably be pretty standard Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Right now, we are targeting a Tuesday evening episode. We're going to talk about the 2024 season of Yennier Cano. He was great. He wasn't as good as he was in 2023, but he was great. But he started to look a little run down. So the question is, how do the Orioles avoid a bad injury with Cano in 2025? We'll talk about that on Tuesday's episode as we go back down to the 3 episodes a week. But don't worry, if anything breaks, the O's make any moves, we'll be right back here. You can expect if the O's make a signing or a trade of a major league player, I will guarantee you at some point that day, live episode right here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. So make sure you're subscribed and hanging out for all your Orioles news. But I'll be back on Tuesday, or maybe earlier if the O's make a move. Until then, though, I am Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.